start with the hot topic. I don't know if anyone is big on social media, but you might have seen an article circulating that the Great Barrier Reef in Australia is dead. The good news is that it's actually not. The bad news is that it is dying as a direct result of climate change. Temperatures in the oceans are going up, the water is warming, and it's having a direct effect on ecosystems in the oceans, specifically with the largest living organism on Earth, the Great Barrier Reef. And I have another image here that you saw earlier today of the polar ice caps. When you look at an image over 30 years ago, you can see that it's much larger than where it was in 2003, and it's shrunk even more to where we are today in 2016. So when we talk about climate change, we know that it affects ecosystems, forests, land, there's extreme droughts, but it has a huge impact on human life. And there are some groups of us who are affected first and worst. So when you think about climate disasters over the last few years, think about images you've seen in the media. What images do you see? Who's being affected first and worst? And where are these climate disasters happening? So if we think the most recent example, which was talked about earlier also, is Hurricane Matthew, and who is affected by Hurricane Matthew. And we saw lots of images coming out of Haiti, the Caribbean. These images on the top is Cuba, and on the bottom is the Dominican Republic. And this is an image of North Dakota, Standing Rock Reservation in North Dakota, where a pipeline is going through a native reservation and is literally digging through a burial ground. And there's images of protesters or water protectors, because if the pipeline goes through and is successful, the pipeline will leak. Pipes leak, that's what they do. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when, and it will affect their only water source. So, climate change, the drivers of climate change, which is the fossil fuel industry, has an effect on all life on Earth, especially an effect on humans, but it does affect some of us first and worst. This is an image of Katrina, only 11 years ago. This is New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina hit. And I went to New Orleans last year on the 10-year anniversary of Katrina and met families who have been displaced and still have not been able to move back to their home. This is an image that I think most of us can remember. The way Hurricane Katrina victims were treated, they were moved into the Astrodome, and most of people affected by Hurricane Katrina actually did not fit and were turned away. So, environmental justice is the movement that fights against environmental racism. And climate justice is the movement globally that puts the issues of those of us affected first and worst by climate change, those of us who tend to live in the global south or low-income communities of color, first, and leading the movement against climate change. In Sunset Park, where I work in Brooklyn, it's a low-income community of color, majority Latino and Asian, majority immigrant community. It's also a community that is home to the largest remaining industrial waterfront in New York City. Our industrial waterfront space has been changed over the last 10, 20 years to house luxury developments, luxury condos, luxury hotels, and Sunset Park's waterfront is in danger of going through that transition as well because of wealthy developers who would like to see that space be used for something else. But traditionally, the waterfront has provided jobs for people who live in Sunset Park. Sunset Park is also the largest walk-to-work community in New York City. We'd like to keep it that way. We also have a vision for the waterfront to be a part of the Just Transitions movement. The industrial waterfront, while it provides jobs that are still based in the fossil fuel economy. We want to transition those jobs, we want to transition that industry away from the fossil fuel-based economy because there is no future in the fossil fuel economy. To continue down the path of supporting the fossil fuel economy is suicidal for the human race. And some of us would be affected first and worse over others. So it is important and imperative to those of us who come from low-income communities of color to be at the forefront of this movement, to be at the forefront of the movement to transition from the fossil fuel-based economy to a renewable, regenerative energy economy. So we do work very closely with the labor movement because members of our community are in the labor movement. It is our communities whose jobs are at stake. So this idea that there is a difference or a dichotomy between the labor movement and the environment is a false dichotomy. It is a division that is being driven by companies that benefit from the fossil fuel economy, and we cannot allow them to divide us. We cannot allow them to divide and conquer, which has always been their strategy since the beginning of colonization. So we have, in Sunset Park, Uprose has worked many years to develop and cultivate relationships with the industries along the waterfront in conversations around a transition and what that would look like. What that would look like for the companies, what that would look like for the workers, what that would look like for the community, to ensure that nobody is left behind. To ensure that in this transition process there is jobs training programs that are available and accessible to our community, that there are more green jobs training programs in schools, starting at the elementary school level, going all the way up through university levels, and that those sort of education programs are accessible to our communities, to those of us who are affected first and worst and who bear the brunt of climate change. We talked about Hurricane Sandy earlier. I don't know if anybody's here from some of the communities affected by Hurricane Sandy. Next year will be the 5-year anniversary. There are people who were displaced from their homes because of Hurricane Sandy who have still not been able to move back into their homes. An image that I have earlier, this is an image of Hurricane Sandy in the Rockaways. The picture on the lower hand is an image of a woman whose home was flooded in the Rockaways, and it's a year later, and her asthma that she already had before Sandy hit has been aggravated because of all the mold as a result of Sandy. So it was also mentioned earlier that Latinos are more likely to die from asthma than any other community group, and that is because we live in environmental justice communities. An environmental justice community is a community that is low income, community of color, and has far too many polluting industries in comparison to other more affluent communities. Sunset Park is another example of that. We have polluting industry in our communities. We also have the Gowanus Expressway that goes through the community. People live right under the expressway, right next to the expressway, but there is no entrance onto the expressway in Sunset Park. So you can get on in Bay Ridge or Park Slope, but you can't get on in Sunset Park. The other two communities I mentioned are the more affluent white communities. So that's not a coincidence. Environmental racism is not a coincidence. Industries that are polluting deliberately go into low-income communities of color because they have the idea that we are not organized, we are not politically savvy, and we don't know policy that already exists to protect our health. And that if we do learn that we're not going to do anything about it or don't have the time or resources to do anything about it. So environmental justice is the movement to fight against deliberate environmental racism, which you can see examples of across the country. Sunset Park is not the only example. The Bronx, for example. Harlem, which is where I'm originally from, is home to a large bus depot and sewage processing plant. Not a coincidence that those industries are not in the Upper East Side, for example. This is true where I used to work in Richmond, California, home to the largest oil refinery on the West Coast, west of the Rockies. It is a predominantly African American and Latino community, and the health disparities, the health problems in that community are out of control. It's true when you look in Texas, the communities surrounding the oil refineries in Texas tend to be immigrant communities, low-income communities, and communities of color, and this is true globally. A lot of industries in the United States that are based in the fossil fuel extraction economy, fossil fuel economy, tend to move to the global south. And when we think about environmental impacts on human health, when we look at Latin America, Africa, and Asia, the health effects are far worse than what we see in the United States. So I will end there and say that I will repeat what some other people have said before. As members of the unions, you have the power to decide whether your union will divest from fossil fuel economy. The request has already been put out to you by elected officials, by union officials, to say you have to drive this movement. You, the members, are not only the ones who can drive this movement and make this movement happen. You have to. Climate change is urgent, but we also live in communities where we will be affected first and worst. So it is our moral responsibility. Our lives depend on it. The lives of our children and our grandchildren depend on it, and you have the power to make it happen.